Summer 1940. The Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat. The world lies at the Führer's feet. Poland has vanished in weeks. Denmark and Norway have fallen. France, a great power that held the German army in a bloody stalemate for 4 years, has collapsed in just 6. The British have been thrown off the continent at Dunkirk. From his panoramic window, Adolf Hitler looks out over the mountains, convinced he is the greatest conqueror in human history. In this fortress of arrogance, his inner circle gathers. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, Joseph Goebbels, master of propaganda, and his high command, generals like Jodl and Keitel. They discuss the future. Britain will be bombed into submission. Russia will be dismantled before winter. There is only one other power that registers, a distant, annoying noise across the Atlantic, the United States of America. Hermann Göring dismisses it with a wave of his hand. The Americans, he famously scoffs, are good at only 2 things, making razor blades and refrigerators. Hitler laughs. It is a laugh of genuine, profound contempt. This laughter is not just bravado. It is the cornerstone of Nazi ideology. To Hitler, America is not a nation. It is a hodgepodge, Mischvolk, a mongrel state weakened by democracy, capitalism, and racial mixing. He calls it a decayed country, a society hopelessly degenerate where Jews pull the strings. In his mind, the American man is soft, corrupted by luxury, obsessed with jazz music, and utterly incapable of the Spartan hardness and total war commitment of the German Volk. This ideological blindness was reinforced by cold, hard military fact. In 1939, as the Wehrmacht, the most professional, technologically advanced, and battle-hardened army on Earth, was carving Poland apart with 1.5 million men, the United States Army was a pathetic, forgotten constabulary force. The numbers are staggering. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than the Army of Portugal. It numbered just 174,000 men. These weren't soldiers in the German sense. They were border guards and coastal defenders. Their equipment was a museum of World War I surplus. Their tanks were flimsy, thinly armored vehicles. Their artillery was horse-drawn. Their standard rifle was the 1903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle older than most of its users. The Louisiana maneuvers of 1940, a desperate attempt to practice modern war, became a legend of dark comedy. Soldiers trained with wooden machine guns. Trucks had tank painted on their sides. Umpires in white armbands would literally rule a unit dead by handing a slip of paper to its commander. One German military attaché observing this army sent a classified report back to Berlin that was almost certainly shared with a smirk. His assessment? The Americans were playing games. They were amateurs, attempting to copy the blitzkrieg they had seen in France, but lacking the hardware, the doctrine, and most importantly, the will. This report and others like it confirmed everything Hitler wanted to believe. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was a finely honed weapon. Its generals had invented modern warfare, its NCOs were career professionals who had trained for a decade. Its soldiers were veterans of Spain, Poland, and now France. They were, without question, the greatest fighting force on the planet. The idea that a nation of shopkeepers and gangsters could, in a matter of years, raise an army to challenge this force was not just unlikely. It was, to the Nazi mind, a racial and historical impossibility. This conviction was so total that on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler stood before his cheering Reichstag and, in an act of supreme hubris, personally declared war on the United States. He did it eagerly, almost gleefully. He was not forced into it by his Japanese allies. He chose it, believing it was a formality. He was swatting a fly. In that speech, he called President Roosevelt a madman, the product of a defective system. He laughed at America's internal chaos, its labor strikes, and its mixed-race population. What Hitler did not know
What he could not possibly comprehend was that he was not declaring war on the 174,000-man garrison force of 1939. He was declaring war on an industrial colossus, an idea of freedom and the untapped, furious resolve of 150 million people. He had just signed the death warrant of the Third Reich. The laughter in the Berghof was loud, confident, and absolute. But it would not last. In America, the sleeping giant had just been awakened by a day of infamy, and that giant was now pulling on its boots.
Hitler's declaration of war on December 11, 1941, was, for America, like a starting pistol echoing across a continent. The distant, annoying noise he had sought to silence instead erupted into a deafening roar of industrial and human mobilization, on a scale the world had never seen and has not seen since. In Berlin, German economists and planners, men far more sober than the ideologues at the Berghof, looked at the numbers and felt a cold dread that Hitler, in his racial arrogance, could not. They understood something fundamental. Germany, for all its efficiency, was a nation of 70 million already engaged in a two-front war. America was an untouched continent of 150 million, with a gross domestic product in 1940 that was already larger than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. And it had just been given a single unifying purpose: total victory. While Hitler laughed at the soft American man, that man was now in a line. In the hours after Pearl Harbor, and every day for months after, recruitment offices from Bangor, Maine to San Diego, California were overwhelmed. The lines of men snaked out the doors, around blocks, in rain, snow, and sun. They were farmers from Kansas, stockbrokers from New York, mechanics from Detroit, high school teenagers lying about their age, and Hollywood movie stars. They were, in every sense, a civilian army. They were, as Hitler correctly identified, shopkeepers, jazz musicians, and college boys. And that was precisely what made the mobilization so terrifying.
A professional militaristic state like Nazi Germany builds its army over decades. It cultivates a warrior caste. It pours its national treasure into a standing force. America, in 1941, did something that defied all military logic. It created a global superpower army and navy from scratch in less than 2 years, as if by sheer force of will. The numbers are the true story. In 1940, the U.S. Army had 174,000 men. By 1942, that number was 1.4 million. By 1943, it was 3.8 million. By 1944, it was 7.9 million. When the war ended in 1945, 16 million Americans, 1 in 8 of all adult males, had worn the uniform of the armed forces. It was the greatest mobilization of human beings in the history of the world. This was the number that began to haunt the German General Staff. Not 174,000, but 16 million. But men without guns are just a mob. Hitler's generals took comfort in this. Germany's arms industry was a fortress of steel, home to giants like Krupp and Rheinmetall, staffed by master craftsmen. America, Göring had joked, made refrigerators. He was correct, and in 1942, America simply stopped. President Roosevelt issued a directive that was breathtaking in its audacity. On February 10, 1942, the last civilian automobile rolled off an American assembly line. The entire civilian auto industry, the largest manufacturing enterprise on Earth, the very symbol of American softness and consumerism, was ordered to pivot, overnight, to war.
The result was a miracle of industrial conversion that Nazi planners like Albert Speer would later study with a mixture of awe and despair. The Chrysler automotive plant in Detroit, which months before had been stamping out fenders for family sedans, was retooled to build M4 Sherman tanks. The Ford Motor Company, master of the assembly line, was tasked with building not cars, but B-24 Liberator bombers. At its peak, the purpose-built factory at Willow Run was churning out one 4-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes. The refrigerator companies, they went to war too. General Motors' Frigidaire division, which had perfected cooling technology, began mass-producing .50 caliber machine guns. The Hoover Vacuum Cleaner Company, it was given contracts to manufacture helmet liners and components for mortar fuses. A company that made toy trains, Lionel, was retooled to produce compasses and navigation equipment for warships. This was the arsenal of democracy. It was not a separate military-industrial complex. It was the civilian complex, simply pointed in a new direction. While German industry, efficient but rigid, struggled to repair bomb damage and source raw materials, American industry was a tidal wave. A German intelligence officer, captured in North Africa in 1943, was interrogated about Germany's strategic view of America. He told his American captors, "We knew about your factories, we had the numbers, but the numbers were so large, so fantastic, that our high command simply refused to believe them. They were dismissed as Jewish propaganda. We thought you were bluffing. We could not conceive of a nation wasting so much steel on automobiles, let alone bombers." It wasn't just the quantity, it was the speed. Shipbuilder Henry J. Kaiser, who had never built a warship, applied his techniques from mass-producing dams to building Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that would form the supply bridge across the Atlantic. When the program began, it took 230 days to build one ship. Kaiser's engineers and workers, many of them women who had never held a rivet gun before, Rosie the Riveter, got that time down and down and down. By 1943, they were building a ship from keel laying to launch in 4 days and 15 hours.
The Germans, with their U-boats, were sinking ships faster than the British could build them. But they soon learned they could not sink them faster than Henry J. Kaiser could build them. This was the force Hitler had laughed at, a civilian army of 16 million, a civilian industry that was now outproducing the entire Axis war machine combined. These shopkeepers and factory workers, these soft Americans, were now building the largest military, navy, and air force the world had ever known, and they were doing it with a speed that defied logic. The laughter in the Berghof had stopped. The men in Berlin were now desperately recalculating the end of the war. The amateurs were coming, and now they had to be trained. 16 million men. The number itself was a weapon. But in 1942, it was a blunt instrument, a formless mass of potential. An army, as the German General Staff knew well, is not a crowd. It is a complex, living organism. It requires a brain, a shared doctrine. It requires a nervous system, a corps of officers and NCOs, and it requires muscle memory, brutal, repetitive, soul-crushing training. Germany had spent a century perfecting this organism. America had 18 months. The result was the largest, fastest, and most ambitious training program in human history. From the sun-scorched deserts of California to the humid swamps of Florida, the entire continent of North America was turned into a single, colossal boot camp. In Berlin, German planners scoffed. Training, they knew, was a matter of Kultur. A German NCO was a career man, a professional, who had dedicated his life to the art of war. He could disassemble a machine gun blindfolded, read a map in the dark, and lead a squad with ruthless efficiency. The American NCO, by contrast, was a 20-year-old former factory worker or gas station attendant who had been given a copy of the Army Field Manual and 3 stripes on his sleeve just weeks before. But the Americans had a different solution. They did not have time to create a warrior caste, so they created a warrior system. They took their greatest civilian strength, mass production and standardization, and applied it to human beings. This was the birth of assembly line training. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the home of the infantry, they didn't just train soldiers, they processed them. New draftees, still in their civilian shoes and carrying cardboard suitcases, would arrive by the trainload, thousands every day. They were immediately put through a dehumanizing, efficient machine. In a single day, they were sheared, deloused, issued uniforms, given a battery of inoculations, and handed their M1 Garand rifle, the weapon that would become their new god. They were then sorted and shipped to specialized camps. Tankers went to Fort Knox, artillerymen to Fort Sill, paratroopers to Fort Bragg. This specialization was key. While a German panzer grenadier was trained for years in combined arms, the American system was designed to make a man very good at one thing very, very fast. The training itself was brutal and, by civilian standards, often fatal. General Leslie J. McNair, the unsung architect of this new army, was a ruthless pragmatist. He had one guiding principle: we must stop killing soldiers in training. This was not a plea for safety, but a demand for realism. He ordered the use of live ammunition in exercises. Men were forced to crawl on their bellies through mud and barbed wire, while real .50-caliber machine guns fired just inches over their heads. Artillery simulators fired real charges to mimic the shell shock of a battlefield. German observers, had they seen it, would have called it madness. It was inefficient, wasteful, and dangerous. But McNair knew he was not training men to fight a war. He was training men to survive their first 90 seconds of combat. He was burning away their civilian softness with the fire of simulated battle.
In the deserts of California and Arizona, General George S. Patton created the Desert Training Center, the largest training area in the world. He took entire divisions, 15,000 men at a time, and threw them into a hellscape of 120-degree heat, sandstorms, and venomous snakes. He forced them on 20-mile marches, deprived them of water, and staged massive, chaotic live-fire tank battles that raged for days. His goal was simple: to make training so miserable, so terrifying, that actual combat would feel like a relief. This civilian army learned fast because it was composed of men who, unlike their European counterparts, had grown up with machines. The average German Lanzer was a peasant or farmer who was comfortable with a horse. The average American GI was a shade tree mechanic who had been tinkering with Ford V8 engines and farm tractors since he was 12. When German engineers captured an American Jeep, they were astonished by its simple, rugged brilliance. But when German mechanics were ordered to repair one, they were baffled. They looked for the high-precision tolerances of a Mercedes engine. Instead, they found a simple, powerful engine built with loose tolerances, designed to be repaired in a muddy field with a hammer and a wrench. This mechanical aptitude was America's secret weapon. When a German Tiger tank, a 57-ton masterpiece of engineering, broke down, it required a specialized recovery vehicle and a team of factory-trained technicians. When an M4 Sherman tank, a 30-ton workhorse, broke down, the crew often fixed it themselves in under an hour, using spare parts they carried with them. The Germans had built a weapon. The Americans had built a tool. While the men trained, the Army was also forging its brain. At Fort Leavenworth and Fort Benning, hundreds of thousands of 90-day wonders were churned out of Officer Candidate School, OCS. Hitler had laughed at the idea of a civilian officer corps, comparing it to his own aristocratic, blue-blooded Prussian Junkers. But the American OCS was a democratic meritocracy. A brilliant college student, a tough construction foreman, or a sharp-witted lawyer could enter as a private and 3 months later emerge as a second lieutenant, with the gold bars on his shoulder and the authority to lead 30 men into battle. This was the machine that was being built. It was loud, chaotic, wasteful, and brutal. It was staffed by amateurs, led by former civilians, and supplied by refrigerator companies. By all the standards of the German Wehrmacht, it should have collapsed under its own weight. But by mid-1943, this machine was ready. This amateur army, now millions strong, was boarding the Liberty ships that had been built in 4 days. They were sailing in convoys of hundreds, protected by the destroyers and carriers that had been built in months. They were not the proud professional conquerors of 1940. They were something else. They were a civilian tide of steel and resolve. The shopkeepers were coming, and they were heading first for the soft underbelly of Europe to test this new army against the battle-hardened veterans of the Reich. The great, terrifying experiment was about to begin.
November 1942. North Africa. The first test. Operation Torch. This was where the civilian army would finally meet the Herrenvolk, the master race. It was not, however, the mighty Wehrmacht of France or Russia they would face first. It was the demoralized, poorly equipped forces of Vichy France. Even this, however, proved a chaotic and bloody affair. The landings were messy, coordination was poor, and the green American troops, tasting combat for the first time, were clumsy. But their sheer numbers and the political capitulation of the French Admiral Darlan carried the day. They had secured their foothold. Now they turned east, into Tunisia, to face the real masters of the desert, the Deutsches Afrikakorps. These were not just soldiers, they were legends. Hardened by 2 years of relentless warfare under their mythical leader, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the Afrikakorps was arguably the most elite, battle-hardened fighting force in the world. They were masters of tank warfare, camouflage, and the brutal, unforgiving logic of the desert. And in February 1943, at a place called Kasserine Pass, they would give Hitler's civilian army its brutal, humiliating education. The Germans, observing the clumsy, road-bound Americans, saw everything their Führer had predicted. The Americans advanced in predictable columns. They dug shallow, indefensible foxholes. Their officers were timid. Their tank tactics were amateurish, and their coordination between infantry, armor, and air power was non-existent. Rommel and his fellow general, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, saw an opportunity for a devastating counterstroke, a blitzkrieg in miniature that would shatter American morale and throw them back into the sea.
On February 19, 1943, they struck. German Panzer IV and Tiger tanks, a weapon the Americans had never seen, with an 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman from a mile away, slammed into the green American positions. The result was a massacre. The American lines didn't bend, they shattered. Entire units dissolved. Soldiers, many of them teenagers who had been in boot camp just months before, threw down their weapons and ran. Tanks were abandoned. Artillery was overrun before it could fire a shot. For 6 days, the Afrikakorps ran rampant, inflicting a humiliating defeat on the U.S. Army. They killed or wounded over 6,000 Americans and captured thousands more. They destroyed nearly 200 tanks. It was, without question, the worst defeat the U.S. Army would suffer in the entire European war. The news sent a shockwave back to Washington. In Berlin, it was cause for celebration. Hitler's contempt was validated. The mongrel army had met true Aryan warriors and had broken, just as he knew they would. His generals reported that the American prisoner, when captured, was a soft specimen, often found with love letters and pictures of movie stars in his pockets, not the steel-hardened fanaticism of the SS. They concluded that the American army, for all its industrial might, lacked the spirit for war.
The reaction was swift and ruthless. Roosevelt, furious,
did not order a retreat. He ordered a change in command. He sent in the man who had forged this army in the deserts of California, General George S. Patton. Patton arrived at the shattered American Second Corps and found exactly what the Germans had seen: a demoralized, undisciplined, sloppy army. He was disgusted. He immediately issued orders that became legendary for their harshness. Steel helmets would be worn at all times, even by doctors in the operating tent. Neckties would be worn, even in the desert heat. Saluting was mandatory. His famous speech to his new officers was brutal. "I will not tolerate sloppy-dressed soldiers. These men are soldiers, they are fighting, and they will act as such. Any man who says he is tired is a goddamn coward." But this was not just about spit and polish. Patton and his brilliant subordinate Omar Bradley began a relentless process of retraining during the war. They drilled the men, fired incompetent officers on the spot, and, most importantly, began to coordinate the one weapon the Germans could not match: artillery. While German panzer generals were masters of tactics, American generals were masters of logistics. The Germans at Kasserine had achieved a brilliant tactical victory, but in the weeks that followed, they were being buried. For every shell their 88s fired, the Americans, now learning, fired back 10. For every tank the Germans lost, a dozen new Shermans rolled off the Liberty ships.
The Africa Corps was a finely honed rapier, but it was starving. Its supply lines across the Mediterranean were being systematically destroyed. It was low on fuel, low on ammunition, and low on tanks. The American Army was a clumsy sledgehammer, but it was connected to an infinite supply of steel. In March and April 1943, the amateur army, now battle-hardened and furious, attacked again. This time, it was different. At El Ghoutar, Patton's infantry held its ground against a desperate panzer counterattack. And for the first time, American artillery showed its true power. Massed battalions of 105mm howitzers, more guns in one place than the Germans had in their entire army, fired in coordinated, devastating barrages that blotted out the sun. The German tanks, for the first time, were stopped cold. The veterans of the Africa Corps were stunned. This was not the same army they had routed at Kasserine. This army was learning, and it was angry. By May 1943, it was over. Pinned between the British in the east and the avenging Americans in the west, with no fuel, no supplies, and no escape, the legendary Africa Corps and its Italian allies surrendered. Over 275,000 battle-hardened Axis soldiers were taken prisoner. Hitler's civilian army, in its very first campaign, had helped destroy the most professional, elite army the Germans had. The lesson of North Africa was terrifying for the German High Command, if they had chosen to see it. Yes, the American soldier was soft to begin with. Yes, he was an amateur. But he learned fast. And he had more bullets, more tanks, more trucks, and more food than any army in human history. The amateurs had just won their first round. Hitler's laughter now was hollow. He had not been wrong about the American soldier of 1940. He had been fatally, apocalyptically wrong about the American nation. The sledgehammer was just getting warmed up.
July 10th, 1943. Sicily. The amateurs were now invaders. Operation Husky. This was not a desperate gambit like North Africa. This was a calculated, overwhelming assertion of power. In a single day, 160,000 American, British and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Sicily, supported by over 3,000 ships. It was, at that moment, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. This was the physical manifestation of the industrial numbers Hitler had dismissed as Jewish propaganda. His generals on the ground, however, could not dismiss the 3,000 ships on the horizon. The civilian army, clumsy no more, stormed ashore. Patton's 7th Army, now hardened by the desert and thirsty for redemption, carved a blistering path across the island. In a controversial 38-day campaign, they outmaneuvered and outfought their German and Italian counterparts, capturing Palermo and winning the race to Messina. The speed and ferocity of the American advance shocked the German high command. This was not the army from Kasserine Pass. This army was aggressive, incredibly well supplied, and fast. But the German in command, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, was a different kind of soldier. He was not a reckless gambler like Rommel. He was a brilliant, pragmatic, and ruthless defensive artist. He evacuated 100,000 Axis troops from Sicily to the Italian mainland, staging a fighting retreat so skillful it infuriated Patton. Kesselring had lost the island, but he had saved his army. And now he was waiting for the Americans on his home ground. Kesselring, unlike the ideologues in Berlin, did not underestimate the Americans. He saw their strength, clearly, their total air superiority, their endless mechanized columns, and their overwhelming artillery. But he also saw their weakness. They were addicted to roads. They were a motorized army, not a walking one. So Kesselring devised a new strategy. He would not try to beat them in the open field. He would lure them into a fortress of his own design, the Italian peninsula.
What followed was not the high-speed blitzkrieg the Americans had trained for. It was a slog. It was a brutal, agonizing inch-by-inch crawl up a spine of rugged mountains, treacherous rivers, and thick, sucking mud. It was a war perfectly designed to neutralize America's mechanized advantage and test the one thing Hitler was certain they lacked, the infantryman's will to fight and die in a bloody war of attrition. The first test was Salerno in September 1943. The U.S. Fifth Army landings were nearly a catastrophe. Elite German panzer divisions, hidden in the hills, counterattacked with ferocious precision, pinning the Americans to their beachhead. For a time, the entire invasion teetered on the brink of collapse. The amateurs were almost thrown back into the sea. They were saved not by brilliant tactics, but by the sledgehammer of American power, the roaring guns of the U.S. Navy firing thousands of shells at point-blank range, and the relentless carpet bombing of the Air Corps, which pounded the German positions into dust. They had held the beach, but Kesselring had just proven his point. The civilian army, for all its material, bled just like any other. And he had an entire country of mountains and rivers to bleed them in. This set the stage for one of the most brutal battles of the war, Monte Cassino. This was the heart of the Gustav Line, a chain of German fortifications carved into the mountains, anchored by a 1,400-year-old monastery. The position was held by the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, German paratroopers, the most elite, fanatical, and battle-hardened infantry in the Wehrmacht. These were the men who had conquered Crete with gliders, the men Hitler trusted above all others. This was the ultimate test. Hitler's soft civilians versus the Übermenschen of the Fallschirmjäger. The battle was a medieval nightmare. The Americans, first the 36th, Texas Division, were ordered to cross the flooded Rapido River at the base of the mountain. It was a suicide mission. The Germans sat on the high ground, their machine guns and mortars pre-sighted. They slaughtered the Texans as they struggled in the icy water.
The division was decimated, losing 1,600 men in 48 hours.
A professional European army might have mutinied. A German general, faced with such losses, might have retreated and re-evaluated. The American response was different. It was industrial. They pulled the shattered 36th Division off the line and inserted the 34th Division to attack again and again and again. When the infantry failed, the arsenal of democracy took over. The American commanders made a controversial decision. They would erase the mountain. On February 15, 1944, a fleet of 229 B-17s and other bombers dropped 1,400 tons of high explosives on the ancient monastery, reducing the priceless landmark to a smoking pile of rubble. Then, for days, Allied artillery pounded the ruins. It was the single heaviest concentration of firepower of the war to date. The Germans were stunned. Not by the attack, the rubble in fact made for an even better defensive position, but by the philosophy behind it. They were fighting an enemy who, when faced with a difficult tactical problem, would simply delete it from the map with an avalanche of high explosives. A captured German paratrooper from Cassino, a veteran of Russia, articulated the growing terror. He told his interrogator, "You Americans, you don't know what it is to fight a war of poverty. We count every bullet, every shell. You fire your artillery all day and all night like you are hosing down a street." He was right. This was the new American way of war. It was the stubborn, bloody-minded grit of the civilian infantryman, now as tough as any Fallschirmjäger, combined with the limitless, wasteful, and terrifying checkbook of the arsenal of democracy. The soft army was now hard. It had passed through the fire of Kasserine and the meat grinder of Cassino. It was no longer an amateur army. It was just an American army. And it was an army that was now ready for the main event. The laughter from the Berghof was a distant, hollow, and pathetic echo. The real invasion was coming. While the civilian army was being bled and forged in the mountains of Italy, an even greater, more terrifying spectacle was unfolding across the English Channel. The Italian campaign, for all its brutal cost, was merely a diversion. It was the preliminary bout designed to draw German reserves south and bloody the Wehrmacht. The main event, the Hauptkampf, was aimed at the heart of Fortress Europe, the beaches of France. And for this, the Americans were not sending an army, they were assembling a new world. From mid-1943 to mid-1944, the island of Great Britain was transformed into the single largest military base in human history. It became, in the words of one observer, America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. This was the physical manifestation of the numbers that Hitler's planners had dismissed as propaganda. Now those numbers were taking physical form, choking the roads of England and filling every port. For the German High Command, this buildup was a source of profound, gnawing anxiety. Their spies and reconnaissance planes, though severely limited by Allied air superiority, brought back reports that were so fantastic they bordered on the absurd. They reported entire forests in the English countryside disappearing, only to be replaced by cities of ammunition boxes stacked 30 feet high. They reported harbors like Southampton and Plymouth so full of ships that, as one pilot famously radioed back, it seems one could walk from England to France on their decks. And then there were the men. By the spring of 1944, over 1.5 million American soldiers had arrived in England. This was the vanguard of the 16 million. They came in an endless stream of troop transports, a bridge of ships that the U-boat wolf packs, now hunted and decimated by Allied naval power, could no longer stop.
The English people, weary from years of bombing and rationing, watched in stunned silence. This was not an army as they knew it. This was an occupation, albeit a friendly one. The Americans brought with them a wave of alien abundance. They had endless supplies of cigarettes, chocolate, and chewing gum. Their jeeps and 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half trucks clogged every narrow country lane. They built hundreds of airfields, vast cities of Nissen huts, and massive supply dumps that dwarfed the local villages. A popular joke of the time was that the only thing keeping England from sinking under the weight of American men and material was the fleet of barrage balloons holding it up. For Hitler and his generals, the central question was not if the invasion was coming, but where. And this is where the civilian army, now led by a new breed of brilliant, pragmatic, and ruthless generals, would prove it was not just a sledgehammer, but also a stiletto. They launched Operation Fortitude, the greatest deception campaign in the history of warfare. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, were hobbled by their own arrogance. They believed they knew the Americans. They knew the Americans were led by Patton, their most famous and, in the German view, best general. They knew that the most logical and shortest route to Germany was from Dover to the Pas-de-Calais. Therefore, the German High Command, and Hitler himself, became unshakably convinced that the main invasion would come at Calais, led by General Patton. The Allies, knowing this, proceeded to feed the German delusion with breathtaking audacity. They created a phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. They invented entire divisions, gave them insignia, and created fake radio traffic. They put General Patton, the man the Germans were obsessed with, in command of this ghost army and placed him visibly in the southeast of England. And then they built him a ghost arsenal. In the fields of Kent, across from Calais, they deployed an army of inflatable rubber. They had inflatable Sherman tanks, inflatable artillery pieces, and inflatable trucks. From the air to a high-altitude German reconnaissance plane, they looked real. They built fake airfields with plywood P-51 Mustangs and P-17s. They built fake supply dumps and fake landing craft. They even created a vast, complex web of radio chatter, broadcasting the mundane, day-to-day signals of a massive army preparing to attack. The Germans, predisposed by their own logic, took the bait completely. They fixated on Calais. They positioned their strongest defensive units, the elite 15th Army, in Calais, digging them into massive concrete bunkers and stocking them with the best tanks and artillery. They had fallen for a trick worthy of Hollywood, orchestrated by an army they had dismissed as amateurs. While this grand illusion held the Germans' gaze, the real army, the U.S. First Army, under the quiet, brilliant General Omar Bradley, was massing in the southwest of England. This was no ghost army. This was the largest, most powerful, and best-equipped fighting force ever assembled. This was the physical result of the arsenal of democracy. The sheer scale of the real invasion force, Operation Overlord, was beyond anything the German mind could process. The numbers were not just large, they were astronomical. 5,300 ships, 11,500 aircraft, 156,000 men in the first 24 hours. The logistics to support them were even insane. In the months leading up to D-Day, 2 million tons of supplies were moved to the embarkation ports. This included 50 million gallons of gasoline, 140,000 vehicles, and mountains of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. This was the army Hitler had laughed at. This army of shopkeepers had mastered logistics on a planetary scale. This army of amateurs was running the most sophisticated deception campaign in history. And this army of soft civilians was now sitting in the pitching darkness of the English Channel on the night of June 5, 1944, checking their M1 rifles, securing their grenades, and waiting for the dawn. The laughter of the Berghof had been a fatal miscalculation. The bill was about to come due.
on 5 bloody stretches of sand in a place called Normandy.
The night of June 5th, 1944, the English Channel. In the howling darkness and churning seas, the greatest armada in human history, over 5,000 ships, pitched and rolled, carrying the destiny of the world on its back. On board, 156,000 men of the civilian army were not laughing. They were, almost universally, terrified and seasick, clutching their rifles, their rosaries, and their ration bags. This was the moment of truth. On the other side, the Wehrmacht, the professional army, was comfortable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had brilliantly fortified the coast, but he, like his Führer, was convinced the main attack would come at Calais, in good weather. The weather on June 5th was atrocious. So confident was the German High Command that no invasion was possible that Rommel himself was not even in France. He was in Germany, celebrating his wife's 50th birthday, planning to meet with Hitler to personally request more panzer divisions for Calais. In the pre-dawn blackness, the first wave of amateurs attacked, not from the sea, but from the sky. 13,000 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, leapt into the chaotic, flak-filled night. Their mission, to seize the causeways and bridges behind the beaches, to sow chaos. The professional German plan for this was simple. If paratroopers land, they must be contained, surrounded, and eliminated by concentrated reserve forces. But the American drop was a disaster. High winds and intense anti-aircraft fire scattered the civilian paratroopers all across the Cotentin Peninsula. Men were dropped into flooded fields and drowned. Units were shattered. Squads landed miles from their objectives. By all metrics of professional textbook warfare, the airborne invasion had failed.
But Hitler had never accounted for the unique, chaotic strength of the amateur soldier. German doctrine relied on rigid top-down command. If a German unit's officer was killed, it often waited for new orders. The American paratrooper, finding himself alone in the dark 20 miles from his drop zone, simply checked his cricket clicker, looked for another amateur, and went to war. Small bands of men, led by sergeants and lieutenants who had been hardware store clerks and football coaches 24 months prior, began attacking everything. They ambushed German patrols, cut communication lines, and seized bridges they just happened to find. They didn't follow the plan. They improvised a new one. The professional German response was paralyzed, receiving reports of American paratroopers everywhere simultaneously. The amateur drop, in its total failure, had become a stunning, chaotic success. Then, at 5:50 a.m., the arsenal of democracy spoke. German sentries in the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall stared out into the gray, pitching sea and saw the horizon explode. A wall of fire from over 1,000 warships erupting from the sea. Battleships like the USS Texas and Arkansas, relics from World War I, fired their 14-inch guns, hurling shells the size of automobiles into the German fortifications. It was the heaviest naval bombardment in history, a display of industrial, material power so overwhelming that it literally shook the earth. But at one beach, it was not enough. Utah Beach, to the west, was a near-perfect textbook landing. The 4th Infantry Division, carried by the current, landed on the wrong beach, one that was lightly defended. They got ashore with relatively few casualties. And then there was Omaha. Omaha Beach was the ultimate test. It was here that Hitler's civilian army would face his hardened veterans, the 552nd Infantry Division, on perfect defensive terrain. It was here that the amateur plan would fail, and the soft American soldier,
would be asked to pay the bill.
Due to the weather, the pre-invasion aerial bombardment completely missed the beach, the bombs falling harmlessly miles inland. The naval bombardment, too short and inaccurate, failed to destroy the concrete bunkers. The specialized duplex drive amphibious tanks, designed to support the infantry, were launched too far out. 27 of the first 32 were swamped by the heavy seas and sank to the bottom of the channel, taking their crews with them. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were sent ashore with no armor, no air support, and no craters to hide in, into the teeth of 88 heavy machine guns, 35 anti-tank guns, and dozens of pre-sighted mortars. It was a massacre. The landing craft ramps dropped, and the men inside were torn to pieces by machine gun fire before they could even step into the water. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down on a tiny sliver of sand with no cover, as mortars rained down upon them. Officers were killed instantly. NCOs died trying to lead. The first wave was not an assault. It was a slaughter. On his flagship, the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley received the reports. First wave pinned down, heavy casualties, no movement, effective enemy fire. He genuinely considered the unthinkable, evacuating the beach. The invasion, the entire war, was teetering on the brink of catastrophic failure.
This was the moment. This was the test Hitler was so sure the soft Americans would fail. By all professional military standards, the assault should have faltered. The surviving men should have surrendered or died. But Hitler never understood the shopkeepers. On the beach, amidst the dead and dying, the amateur NCOs and surviving officers took charge. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry waded through the surf, pointed up the bluff, and famously yelled, "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." In ones and twos, then in dozens, small groups of men, engineers with Bangalore torpedoes, infantrymen with rifles, men who were terrified, seasick, and watching their friends die, did the impossible. On their own initiative, with no grand coordinated plan, they began to move forward. They blew holes in the barbed wire. They began the long, deadly crawl up the 100-foot bluffs into the face of the machine guns. By 1 p.m., the amateur army, through sheer, bloody-minded, individual determination, had broken through. They had scaled the bluffs and were fighting in the German trenches. They were not supermen. They were terrified, but they were not soft. And where was the Führer? When his generals reported the landings, they were afraid to wake him. When he finally woke around 10 a.m. and was told of the invasion, he was delighted. He clapped his hands. "The news couldn't be better," he exclaimed. He was convinced this was the diversion. This was the small attack designed to lure his panzers away from Calais, where Patton's real army, the one made of inflatable rubber, was waiting to land. He refused to release his panzer reserves. The greatest amateur army in history was ashore, and the greatest conqueror of all time was still completely fooled. The laughter of the Berghof had turned into a fatal delusion.
The civilian army was ashore. They had paid the butcher's bill in blood on the sands of Omaha and secured their foothold. But the victory of D-Day was perilously shallow, a strip of liberated land only a few miles deep. Behind this thin line, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was still convinced it was a trap. He continued to hold his best panzer divisions at the Pas de Calais, waiting for Patton's real army, the one made of rubber and air, to make its move. This fatal delusion, born of his own arrogance, gave the Allies a window. But it was a window that opened not onto the rolling fields of France, but into a green claustrophobic hell. This
was the bocage. The American tankers and infantrymen who had trained in the wide-open deserts of California or the clear-cut forests of Georgia were now plunged into a landscape for which nothing could have prepared them. The bocage was a nightmarish medieval maze of small, sunken fields separated by massive, ancient hedgerows. These were not the manicured hedges of an English garden. They were 10-foot-high, 15-foot-thick embankments of earth, stone, and tangled centuries-old roots, all topped with thorny bushes. For the Wehrmacht, the professional army, this was the perfect defensive terrain. It was a sniper's paradise, an anti-tank trap of divine providence. A single, well-hidden MG-42 machine gun, the Hitler's buzzsaw, could command an entire field, turning it into a killing antechamber. A single Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon wielded by a teenage soldier could wait in perfect ambush in the sunken lanes and kill a 30-ton Sherman tank from 50 yards. The amateur army's greatest strengths, its mobility, its mechanized columns, its tactical air power, were rendered utterly useless.
The war in the hedgerows became a bloody, intimate, and soul-crushing nightmare. It was a war of infantry, a war fought with bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers. Progress was not measured in miles, but in fields, one field at a time. A company of 200 men might be ordered to take a single field, and by the end of the day, 80 of them would be dead or wounded. The casualty rates began to rival the darkest days of World War I. The German commanders, now finally understanding that this was the main invasion, reported back to Berlin with a renewed sense of professional contempt. The Americans, they said, were clumsy. They were wasting men in crude frontal assaults. Their tanks were inferior. Their infantry lacked tactical cunning. They were, in short, amateurs trying to fight a professional's war, and they were paying the price in blood. The American command was desperate. The invasion was bogged down, in danger of stalling completely. They needed a solution to the hedgerows, and they needed it now. And that solution, when it came, was the perfect embodiment of the civilian army Hitler had so fatally misjudged. It did not come from a West Point textbook or a high command planning session. It came from a 28-year-old sergeant from New York named Curtis G. Cullen. Cullen, a former factory worker, was standing with his men looking at a shattered German beach obstacle, one of the massive steel hedgehogs Rommel had planted on the sand. He had an idea. He proposed taking the steel from these obstacles, cutting it up and welding it to the front of a Sherman tank to create a set of massive, sharp tusks. It was a shopkeeper's solution. It was improvised, ugly, and had no basis in official military doctrine. A junior officer passed the idea up the chain. In the rigid, aristocratic Prussian officer corps, such a suggestion from a sergeant might have been dismissed as impertinence. In the amateur American army, General Omar Bradley, the GI's general, heard the idea and saw its genius. He didn't form a committee. He didn't send the design back to Detroit. He ordered every ordnance and maintenance unit in Normandy to immediately start scrounging scrap metal and retrofitting every tank they could find.
Within days, mechanics, welders, and factory workers in uniform were mass-producing the new device in the field. They called it the Rhino. On July 25th, the attack was renewed. The Germans waited in their ambush positions, listening for the sound of spinning tracks. Instead, they heard a terrifying new sound, the crash of steel, as the Rhino tanks, their tusks biting deep, smashed through the base of the hedgerows, bursting into the fields with their cannons and machine guns blazing. The amateur sergeant had just unlocked the bocage. The stiletto had made the opening. Now, the sledgehammer would fall. General Bradley, to support this new breakthrough, unleashed Operation Cobra. It was the arsenal of democracy focused with a terrible, vengeful fury. He ordered 2,500 American heavy bombers, B-17s, B-24s, and medium bombers to carpet bomb a tiny 7-square-mile patch of the German line. For 3 hours, the sky vanished. The earth convulsed. Tens of thousands of tons of high explosives rained down not just on the German front lines, but on their reserves, their command posts, and their supply dumps. It was not a tactical bombing. It was an annihilation. The elite German Panzerlehr Division, which had been moved up to stop the breakout, was literally vaporized. Men were atomized in their foxholes. Tanks were flipped upside down like toys. Survivors were found wandering in a catatonic state of shell shock, their eardrums burst, their minds shattered, unable to speak, the victims of a form of industrial violence they had never dreamed possible. When the last bomb fell and the dust began to settle, the civilian army attacked. They punched a hole miles wide through the smoking, cratered moonscape where the German army had been. The amateurs hadn't just fought their way out of the hedgerows. They had erased their way out with the display of industrial violence so total, so wasteful, and so overwhelming that no army on earth could withstand it. The laughter of the Berghof was now a distant, pathetic memory. The hole was open, and into that hole, General Omar Bradley unleashed his most feared, most controversial, and most American general, George S. Patton. The breakout was on.
The hole was open. On August 1, 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had been secretly massed in the bocage, became operational. What poured through the gap created by Operation Cobra was not a conventional army. It was a torrent. It was the physical manifestation of the American civilian industrial philosophy. A fully motorized, gas-guzzling, fast-moving tidal wave of men and steel. The German High Command, the professionals, were paralyzed. Their maps, their training, their entire doctrine had no answer for this. They had been trained for a war of maneuver, but this was a war of logistics. They watched in disbelief as Patton's armored columns simply bypassed their fortified strongpoints. The amateur Americans weren't stopping to fight. They were racing for the horizon, for the Seine, for Paris, for the heart of Germany. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, the German commander in France, knew he had one last desperate chance. He saw Patton's armored spearheads becoming, in his professional view, overextended. He would do what a professional German general was trained to do. He would launch a perfectly timed, concentrated panzer counterattack. He would strike west at the town of Mortain, cut off Patton's supply lines, and trap the entire Third Army. It was a brilliant, textbook plan. It was what Hitler demanded. On August 7th, he struck. 4 elite panzer divisions, including the 2nd SS Das Reich, slammed into one single overextended American division, the 30th Infantry.
This was it, the ultimate test. Hitler's finest, most battle-hardened SS fanatics versus a civilian National Guard division from the Carolinas nicknamed Old Hickory. The Germans hit them in the dark with Tiger and Panther tanks, fully expecting the amateurs to shatter and run, just as they had at Kasserine Pass. But this was not Kasserine. The men of the 30th Division held. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and overrun, but they did not break. One unit, the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry, was cut off and surrounded on a piece of high ground called Hill 314. For 6 days, they were pounded by panzer fire, artillery, and infantry assaults. They ran out of water, medical supplies, and ammunition.
They called in American artillery fire on their own position to break up the final German assaults. They held. And in the skies above, the amateur Air Force delivered the killing blow. The German panzers, massed for their attack, were caught in the open by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. The pilots, with total air supremacy, turned the Mortagne Valley into a tank graveyard. They flew hundreds of sorties, firing rockets and 50 caliber bullets that tore the German armor apart. The professional, textbook German counterattack had been stopped cold by the stubborn grit of a civilian infantry division and an amateur Air Force with unlimited rockets.
Von Klug's gamble had failed, and in failing, he had doomed his entire army, because Patton never stopped. While the 30th Division held the line, the Third Army just kept going. The amateur general was now conducting the greatest pursuit in military history. In 2 weeks, the Third Army advanced 400 miles, liberating an area the size of Great Britain. It was the blitzkrieg the Germans had invented, but on a scale they had never been able to sustain. And this exposed the single most fatal flaw in Hitler's entire worldview. He had laughed at the civilian army, at the shopkeepers and refrigerator makers, but he had forgotten to laugh at the American truck driver. Patton's army was consuming 700,000 gallons of gasoline per day. The advance was so fast that the official supply system, based on ports and railways, had completely broken down. A professional German general would have been forced to halt, regroup, and let his supplies catch up. This was the logistical culminating point that had doomed Rommel in Africa and von Paulus in Stalingrad. The American solution was perhaps the most civilian and most brilliant operation of the war, the Red Ball Express. It was not a military operation in the German sense. It was a civilian one run by the army. They simply took the main highways from the Normandy beaches to the front, declared them one-way routes, and shut them down to all other traffic. Then they unleashed 6,000 deuce-and-a-half trucks, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a non-stop rolling convoy of gasoline and ammunition.
The men who drove these trucks were not elite Panzer Grenadiers. They were the men Hitler held in the lowest possible contempt. They were former gas station attendants, delivery boys, and farmers. And in a still segregated army, 75% of them were African American soldiers, men denied equal rights at home, who were now the beating heart of the fastest army on earth. They drove with headlights blazing at night, defying air attack. They were popped with amphetamines to stay awake for 48 hours straight. They fixed their own engines on the side of the road. While the professional Wehrmacht, the conquerors of 1940, were now so low on fuel that they were literally commandeering horses and carts, reverting to the technology of Napoleon's army. The amateur army was being refueled on the move by African American truck drivers. It was the ultimate, humiliating refutation of Nazi ideology. The result of this logistical miracle was the Falaise Pocket. The German 7th Army, its panzer divisions out of fuel and its infantry on foot, was surrounded. The professional army, the finest fighting force of the 20th century, was trapped. What followed was an annihilation. Allied artillery and air power turned the pocket into a corridor of death. The scenes were so horrific that even veteran combat pilots vomited in their cockpits. It was a field of 40,000 dead, 10,000 dead horses, and a tangled, burning scrap heap of thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the amateur general who had orchestrated the whole thing, flew over the pocket.
He was seen to turn pale and wrote later, "It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh." The Wehrmacht in France had ceased to exist. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. The civilian army, the amateurs who'd been slaughtered at Kasserine Pass just 18 months before, had just destroyed the greatest professional army in the world in less than 90 days. The laughter was over.
It was over. The Wehrmacht in France was not just defeated, it was annihilated. The amateur army in a single summer had liberated France, shattered 50 German divisions, killed or wounded 500,000 professional soldiers, and captured 200,000 more. They were now at the Siegfried Line, the very border of the German homeland. In the Berghof, there was no more laughter. There was only rage, denial, and the frantic shuffling of maps. But Adolf Hitler, in his delusional bunker in East Prussia, had one last desperate gamble to play. He was still convinced, even now, that the civilian army was a hollow shell. He saw their rapid advance and did not see strength, he saw weakness. He saw the Red Ball Express not as a miracle, but as a stretched, vulnerable supply line. He saw the soft American soldiers now resting in the forests of the Ardennes and believed they were weak, decadent, and incapable of fighting in the winter. He would gather his last best reserves, elite SS Panzer divisions, rebuilt in secret, and hurl them through the Ardennes just as he had done in 1940. He would split the Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the amateur democracies to sue for peace. It was a plan born of pure ideological contempt. He was, in essence, trying to rerun the Kasserine Pass massacre, but on a strategic scale. On December 16, 1944, in the midst of a blinding blizzard, he struck. The Battle of the Bulge began. And for 48 hours, it seemed Hitler was right. The civilian army, caught completely by surprise in what they thought was a quiet sector, was routed. Green, untested American divisions were shattered. Thousands of soft Americans were captured. Thousands more ran. The most elite SS stormtroopers, led by Otto Skorzeny and dressed in American uniforms, a trick Hitler believed would confound the stupid Americans, caused chaos behind the lines. The professional German army, in one last brilliant, terrifying assault, was winning. And then they came to a town called Bastogne.
Bastogne was a critical crossroads, defended by one of the amateur divisions from D-Day, the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles. The 101st was completely surrounded. They were outnumbered 5-1. They had no winter clothing, limited ammunition, and dwindling medical supplies. The German panzer commanders, confident of victory, sent a formal delegation to the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, demanding his surrender to avoid the total annihilation of his forces. This was the moment. The professional warrior offering formal, correct terms to the amateur civilian. The American response became the single greatest legend of the civilian army. McAuliffe, a 90-day wonder officer, read the long, formal German demand. He laughed. He then wrote his one-word reply on a piece of paper and had it delivered to the Germans. That reply? Nuts.